As America's imperialist war efforts raged on in Vietnam, the conflict would prove to be far more challenging than the US would expect, and would be even more unpopular back home. There were numerous reasons as to why people were upset with the war, whether it was the Gulf of Tonkin incident being a scam, people being forced to fight with drafts, the US bombing the hell out of Vietnam, the use of chemical weapons, and American imperialism all caused a lot of people to be against the war. So of course, this would lead to people protesting about it, with there being a repeating theme to them. Protests would become a police riot. In 1968, 4 years after America first sent troops into Vietnam, several anti-Vietnam War and anti-racist groups set out to Chicago during the 1968 Democratic National Convention on August 24th. The most prominent of these groups were the MOBE, the Black Panther Party, the South Christian Leadership Conference, and the Yippies, who organized the event in Chicago. The Democratic National Convention was held to figure out who would be the Democratic nominee for POTUS, as Lyndon B. Johnson didn't want to run again. At the end of the convention, they would elect Hubert Humphrey as their nominee. As the conference ran on, numerous protests would start around Chicago, and the convention house in Hilton the congresspeople were staying at. The protesters organized protests from August 23rd to August 29th, with the protesters not being able to get permits to be legally protesting, as the government refused to hand any out. And before the convention could even start, the government brought in 23,000 police and National Guard and stationed them around the convention, hotel, and parks. The peak of the police violence was on the 28th, when the police fully charged at the protesters with batons, bayonets, and tear gas, attacking literally everyone there and standing around. There were 10,000 protesters at the peak of the protests, and the police riot on the protesters lasted for 17 minutes, with the whole thing being recorded while the convention was still going on. These protests would also start the infamous Chicago 8 trial, which itself would be pretty insane, but gets cut for a time save. Two years later, in Ohio, another pretty crazy police riot would occur. So on May 2nd, 2 days after Nixon would announce the US sending troops into Cambodia, students at Kent State University would lead a protest opposing the invasion. On the same day, the National Guard was called up and sent to the university by Ohio's governor after being called by Kent's mayor. The National Guard sat around on campus, consisting of 1,000 soldiers, with them even apparently having tanks. And later in the night of the same day, the ROTC, or the Reserve Officers Training Corps building, would be burnt down, as seen in many other universities. And on May 3rd, there was reported random vandalism that happened in Kent, with it never being confirmed to have been students that did it or just random people. The following day, the students would again lead a protest on the school's commons that was outside just on grass, with this protest primarily being about the National Guard's occupation at the school, but it still being primarily against the Vietnam War. During the protests, the police would escalate things several times by them parading around in several groups, and with them even aiming their loaded guns at students who didn't think the guns would be actually loaded. And at around noonish, the police would advance on the students and push them out of the commons area using tear gas. Students would disperse from the field, and so would the guards, who would just wander around away from the commons, with the students waiting to see where the guards were going, with some of them just leaving. But as the police turned back to head to the commons, they spun around and just started firing down into a nearby crowd of students for literally no reason. The National Guard would respond by closing the school 3 hours later and would try to blame the students for firing first, which was literally just a lie. The Kent State shooting wouldn't be the only mass shooting committed by police around the time it happened, but stood out for two reasons. The first being, it was the first time cops shot directly at white students, as the cops had shot up other universities, with them being mainly black universities. And it would also start a massive student protest that consisted of millions of student-led walkouts.
But why did you start?
Because I was hungry.
You were justified, but you're still going to get arrested. That's what I'm saying.
No, I don't justify it. I'm accountable. See, there's a difference. You can't.
That's not what I'm saying. I understand where you come from, but I'm still going to arrest you. I'm still going to do my job.
Because this is a job.
Yeah, I'm still going to do it. So I understand your story. I hear
I'm still doing
but you're still going to jail. That's what I'm saying. Is it justified?